The man from the bank arrived at 8:20 on a Monday morning, his black Ford pulling slow down the frozen ruts of the road, like he already owned every inch of it. I was in the barn when I heard the engine. Creed heard it too. The big Angus bull lifted his head from the water trough and stood still, ears forward, the way animals go quiet before weather arrives. I set down the feed scoop and walked to the barn door, and there he was, wide through the shoulders, his hat clean, his shoes city clean, even with frost on the ground. He was maybe 50, with the kind of face that has made comfortable decisions for a long time. He didn't offer his hand. He said the name of the bank and the amount, $3,200, and he said the date, March 10th, 1954, the way a judge says a sentence, 9 days. He held out the envelope and looked past me at the barn wall while I took it, like he was already measuring the timber. I don't remember exactly what I said back to him, something short. He nodded once and turned around and walked back to the black Ford and drove out the same frozen ruts he came in on. I stood in the barn doorway and read the notice twice. The language was formal and cold and very specific. The mortgage note dated June 14th, 1951. Principal balance of $3,200, 60 days in arrears, foreclosure proceeding to commence on or before March 10th, in the absence of full payment. The name on the note was my grandfather's, his handwriting, his signature. I knew the shape of it from 30 years of Christmas cards and the inside covers of books. I folded the paper along its original creases and put it in the left breast pocket of the barn coat. His coat, the dark green canvas one, oil-stained at the cuff where he used to wipe the dipstick. And I stood there, another minute in the cold doorway, while Creed went back to the trough. I fed him, I fed the cows, I forked hay to Pepper, and she took it without looking at me, breath rising in slow columns in the cold air. I counted the hens out of habit, all 22, moving in their small, anxious circles. The farmall sat in the corner of the machine shed under a canvas tarp, and I didn't look at it. Outside, the fields were still iron-hard, gray under a gray sky, the fence lines running out to the northeast, where the dead bur oak stood at the corner of the property like something left on purpose. I had walked past that tree 100 times since I was small. I had never thought about what was under it. I didn't say anything to anyone that day. I just kept moving, the way my grandfather had taught me, and waited to understand what I was up against. That night, I brought the tin box down from the shelf above the stove, where my grandfather had kept it wedged between a coffee can of rubber bands and a seed catalog from 1949. The box was an old velvet tobacco tin, painted red, the lid bent slightly so it never closed flush. I had seen him open it maybe twice my whole life, and he had never invited me to look inside. I set it on the kitchen table under the overhead bulb and pried the lid. There was not much. A rubber band held together a stack of receipts from the Shelby County Co-op, most of them going back to 48, 49, 50, seed corn, diesel, a replacement belt for the farmall. There were 3 years of property tax filings, each one paper-clipped to its paid receipt, the ink faded to a pale brown. There was a folded bill of sale for Creed, dated June 1952, $12. There was a letter from the county extension office about soil testing that had never been opened. And at the bottom, held flat by everything else, was the promissory note. I unfolded it carefully. It was a single page, typed on Harlan Savings and Loan letterhead, dated September 4th, 1951. $3,200, payable in full by March 10th, 1954, at 4.5%. The signature at the bottom was my grandfather's. I recognized the way he made his capital E, 2 horizontal lines instead of 3, a habit from his own schooling. I read it twice, then a third time. The collateral line read, "The Aldrin Farm Property, 140 acres, Shelby County, Iowa, as described in deed of record." I sat with that phrase for a long time. As described in deed of record. I got up and checked the rest of the tin box. careful, lifting each paper and setting it flat. No deed. I opened the 2 kitchen drawers that held anything besides utensils. I checked the shelf again. I looked inside the seed catalog, on the off chance something had been tucked there. Nothing. A deed of record meant something filed at the courthouse, but if there was a deed of record, the bank's lien would be attached to it, and I would need to know what kind of deed it was before I understood what Pruitt actually held over this land. And I did not know what kind of deed it was. I did not know if there even was one on file. I had never had reason to ask. I sat back down in the chair and looked at the promissory note until the words stopped meaning anything, the way a word will if you read it long enough. The stove had burned low. I did not get up to feed it. The paper that makes this ours. I fell asleep in the chair sometime after midnight with the overhead bulb still burning and the note still open on the table in front of me. I woke before 5 with my neck stiff and the bulb still burning and the promissory note exactly where I'd left it. The stove had gone cold. I fed it without thinking. 3 splits of oak, the damper cracked open, and pulled on my grandfather's barn coat over my clothes from the day before. It was still dark when I stepped outside. The yard was frozen, the mud locked back into hard ridges from the last thaw, and the air had that particular stillness that comes before a Midwest sunrise in early March, when the cold isn't angry anymore, just patient. Creed was moving in the lot. I could hear him before I could see him, that low, shifting weight of a bull that knows the hour but doesn't care. I fed the cattle first, then the hens, then I stood at the fence and looked east, and when the sky went gray enough to walk by, I walked. My grandfather had a name for this. He called it running the corners, and he did it every spring before he put a single seed in the ground. You go boundary to boundary, he told me once. You don't hurry it. You let the land remind you what it is. I had gone with him twice as a boy and spent most of both times thinking about other things. I understood it differently now. I went south first, along the fence line where the pasture meets the road, then cut east across the back 40 where the ground was still winter gray, the old corn stalks from last fall beaten flat by snow and frost. The soil under my boots had that particular spring density, firm enough to walk without sinking, but with a give in it, a hint of what's coming. I counted fence posts out of habit, 14 posts to the corner. I turned north. The northeast corner was the last one. By the time I reached it, the sky had gone from gray to the color of a tin roof, and the light was low and horizontal, the kind that finds every edge. The bur oak stood at the corner the way it always had, 60 feet of dead wood, the bark long since peeled down to the gray beneath, the crown a tangle of bare branches against the pale sky. I had walked past that tree 100 times in my life without stopping. That morning I stopped. One major limb had fallen and was lying on the ground, pointing northeast. I don't know when it fell, years ago, maybe before I was born. I stood there and looked at it for a long moment, the direction it pointed, the way the roots had heaved the ground up slightly at the base, the way the whole tree seemed to lean away from something rather than toward it. I could not have told you what I was noticing. It wasn't intuition, it was just attention, the way you attend to a thing when you can't afford to miss anything. I turned and walked back to the house. The coffee was cold. I reheated it on the stove and sat down with the promissory note again. 9 days had become 8. The attic stairs ran up from the back hallway, behind the door that always swelled shut in winter and had to be shouldered open. I had been in the attic twice in my life, once as a boy, once when we moved Grandpa's extra furniture up after the downstairs bedroom got a new floor. Both times he had come with me. This time I went alone. The light up there was a single bare bulb on a pull chain, 40 watts, and it did about half the job. I gave my eyes a moment to settle. The attic ran the full length of the house, low-ceilinged at the edges where the roof pitched down, and it smelled of dry wood and old paper and something else, something mineral, like the smell of a field in March before the first rain. There were cardboard boxes stacked along the south wall, a brass floor lamp with a broken shade, a set of bed rails leaning against the chimney stack, and along the north wall, the cedar chest. It was the length of a steamer trunk, sitting on 4 short legs that had been added later, the kind of repair a practical man makes when the original hardware fails. The lid had a simple brass clasp, no lock. I knelt in front of it and went through everything inside: linens, a christening gown wrapped in muslin, a bundle of Christmas cards tied with kitchen twine, 2 ledger books from the 1930s that recorded nothing but grain prices and weather observations. No deed, no title certificate, no document of any kind that bore the county seal. I was about to close the lid when I noticed the interior depth was wrong. I sat back and looked at it. The outside of the chest came to my hip when I stood. The inside of the lid was not much lower than the rim, but the bottom, the visible bottom, the one lined with cedar planking, sat 3 inches higher than it should have. I pressed it with my palm. It gave slightly, a flex that solid wood doesn't make. I found the edge with my thumbnail. It lifted. The false bottom came up in one piece, a cedar panel fitted so cleanly that the gap was invisible until you were looking for it. Beneath it, in the dark space between the cedar lining and the true floor of the chest, there was one object: a small notebook. Red cloth cover, faded to the color of old brick, no larger than my hand. I picked it up. The cloth was soft with handling, the spine slightly split. I carried it to the pull-chain bulb and opened it. The handwriting inside was my grandfather's, the same hand that had written feed orders and weather notes and birthday cards my whole life. I tilted the notebook toward the light and read the first page. Then I carried it downstairs to the lamp and sat down. I sat at the kitchen table until the lamp burned low on oil and I didn't move to fill it. The notebook had 94 pages. I know because I counted them, later, when I was trying to account for all of it. My grandfather had filled 71 of those pages over roughly 30 years, writing in the same deliberate hand I'd watched sign feed tickets at Merritt's Co-op since I was old enough to sit on the counter. The entries weren't dated every time. Some were weather notes. March frost took the second cutting, 1938. And some were half-finished thoughts that broke off mid-sentence, the pen lifted and never returned. But enough of them had dates that I could follow the years forward like a slow river. I read until midnight and went to bed without finishing it. That was Wednesday. Thursday, I fed the cattle before first light, broke ice off the water trough with the flat of a fence post, counted all 8 cows and the 2 heifers moving in the dark against the gray snow. The bull, standing apart from them the way he always did, watched me without interest. I gave Pepper her grain and scratched her jaw where she liked it, and she pushed back against my hand. Then I came inside, ate 2 eggs standing at the stove, and sat back down with the notebook. The drought years were in there. 1936, when his father, my great-grandfather, didn't speak for 3 weeks, just worked from before dawn until he couldn't see, and my grandfather, 22 years old, followed him in silence because that was all there was to offer. There was an entry about a February in 1940, when 4 calves died in 1 week, the cold finding them before the colostrum could, and he'd written only, "Buried the last one by the elm row. Didn't tell Dad until supper." I had to set the notebook down after that one. He was not a man I'd known as young. I'd only known him old, deliberate, a little slow on the stairs. Reading these pages, I kept stopping to recalibrate. This was the same man, 60 feet away in the ground right now, who had carried dead calves through February dark and said nothing until supper. I reached the April 1943 entry on Thursday evening, somewhere around 7 o'clock. The lamp was lit. Outside, the wind had picked up and was pressing at the west-facing window in long, flat pushes. The entry was 7 lines. I read it once, and my eyes went back to the beginning before I'd consciously decided to. I read it a second time, slowly, working through each phrase the way you work a key in a frozen lock. Then I read it a third time and set the notebook flat on the table with both palms resting on the page as if it might move. Any corner, under old Marta's oak, 3 feet, the paper that makes this ours. Do not let the bank have it before you look. 7 days left. I didn't sleep much. The wind kept at the window until past midnight, and when it finally quit, I lay in the dark with the notebook entry running through my head like a wheel stuck in mud, turning over the same ground. The paper that makes this ours. I kept testing the words for what they might mean and what they might not mean. I didn't let myself land on any one interpretation because I was afraid to, and that fear itself told me something. By 5:30 I was up, fed the hens, moved hay to the cattle, checked the water trough, ice skin on it, not thick enough to worry about. Creed watched me from the far corner of the pen the way he always did, sizing up the morning. I went through all of it slowly, deliberately, because the work was the only thing that kept the clock from feeling like a weight on my chest. After breakfast, I put on the barn coat and walked west. The road was frozen hard, the ruts locked solid from the overnight cold. 1.5 miles to his place. I walked it in 22 minutes with my hands in my pockets and the notebook pressed flat against my ribs inside the coat. He was in his equipment shed when I came up the drive, bent over a cultivator tooth, and he straightened when he saw me, set the wrench down. He was 67 and moved like a man who had stopped apologizing for how long things took. He read my face without asking. We went inside. His kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke and something baked the day before. I sat at his table and took out the notebook and read the entry aloud. All 7 lines. Then I set it on the table between us. He was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled the notebook closer and read it himself, once, twice. He went still, not the stillness of confusion, but the stillness of a man arranging something large and complicated into order inside his head. He'd been a county surveyor for 31 years. He knew what land records looked like and what they meant and which ones superseded which. He said, "A federal land patent under the Homestead Act isn't a deed in the ordinary sense. It's a federal grant. The government conveyed title directly and absolutely. No state lien, no county mortgage, no bank note attaches to the underlying title if the patent was properly issued and if," this was the part he paused on, "if it was never recorded, it still exists. Recording is constructive notice, not creation. The title transferred when the patent was signed." He said, "If that box is there and that patent is in it, the bank never had a valid lien on the land itself, only on whatever your grandfather signed against his interest, not against the title, and a man cannot mortgage what he does not own free of prior federal grant." I noticed I had stopped breathing. I walked home in the dark with the notebook inside my coat, pressed flat against my ribs. I did not sleep. I lay on the iron frame bed in my grandfather's room and listened to Pepper shift in the barn and counted the days on the ceiling. Saturday was 2 days away. March 10th was 7 days after that. I had done this arithmetic before, but now it meant something different. Not the countdown to losing something, but the countdown to finding it, which felt more dangerous somehow, because finding it meant the thing had to actually be there. Saturday, March 6th. I was up before the sky lightened. I pulled on my grandfather's coat and went out to the northeast corner of the farm with the long-handled spade, the one he'd kept hanging on 2 nails in the equipment bay. The ground at the base of the dead oak was harder than I'd expected. The first 4 inches came up in chips, more like breaking ice off a pond than digging soil. Below that was frozen earth packed tight as brick, and I worked the spade in short chopping strokes and made poor progress, and my arms burned. At 8 inches, the frost gave way to softer ground, dark and damp, and I moved faster. The fallen limb lay just to my left, its bark gone gray and splitting, pointing northeast the way it always had. I had not thought about that before, that it was pointing, but I thought about it now. At 2 feet, I hit something resistant. My pulse went up before I understood it was just a root, a lateral root fanning out from the trunk. I worked around it carefully. The spade handle torqued wrong against the root's edge, and I heard the crack before I felt it. A dry, sharp pop, and then the handle was in 2 pieces in my hands. The iron blade sat in the hole. I stood there, holding the top half of a ruined spade, and the morning light was coming up gray and cold, and the cattle were watching me from the far fence line. I went inside. I heated coffee on the stove and sat with it a long time. Then I drove the truck 1.5 miles west to my neighbor's place and knocked on the door and told him I had started but needed a heavier mattock, that the root system near the base was dense. He asked no questions. He handed me the mattock from his equipment shed and told me to bring it back when I was done. I drove home. I set the mattock in the barn and fed the cattle and Pepper and collected 12 eggs from the hens and cleaned the water troughs. I did not go back to the oak that day. The ground would not be any softer before morning, and I had learned already that hurrying into frozen ground with the wrong tool accomplished nothing except breaking what you brought with you. Sunday, I was up before 4. The ground was harder at 4 in the morning than it had been the day before. I had not expected that. I lit the lantern and carried it out to the northeast corner and set it in the fork of a low branch of the fence post nearest the oak, and it threw a small yellow circle onto the frozen earth. I could see my breath. I could see the breath of the cattle in the far dark little white puffs, rising from the fence line like they were watching again. I started with the mattock. The first hour I worked through the remaining surface roots, the ones that had stopped the spade. They were dead roots, white inside, dry, no sap, and the mattock split them well enough, though each swing sent a shock up through my wrists and into my shoulders. I took them out in sections and threw them behind me into the dead grass. The hole from 2 days ago had half frozen over at the walls, and I had to chip those clean before I could go deeper. I worked in a slow circle, widening before I deepened, the way Herschel had said to read soil, patience first, then force. 2 feet down, the ground changed, still cold but looser. Whoever had packed this soil last had packed it by hand, not by machine. There were no rocks in it, which was unusual for ground this close to old root systems. I noticed that. I did not say anything about it. I just kept swinging. The mattock struck something at just under 3 feet. The sound was not the sound of stone. It was a dull, dense ring, short, absorbed, like striking something that had weight and did not want to give it up. I stopped. I crouched. I set the mattock aside and reached down into the hole with both hands and began to move the soil with my fingers, pulling it loose in clumps, pushing it out over the lip. My hands found the edge of it after about 4 minutes of clearing. It was rectangular. The corners were sharp, man-made sharp, not worn smooth by years in the earth. The surface was rough with rust, granular under my fingernails, but the iron beneath was solid. I worked my fingers under one side and found it welded, fully welded, no hinge I could locate in the dark. I cleared the last of the soil from the top and worked it free from the ground and lifted it out. It weighed more than I expected. I carried it inside with both hands, set it on the kitchen table, and lit the lamp. I sat down across from it. The lamp burned low, and I did not turn it up. I just sat. Outside the farm was quiet and settling into the last cold hour before dawn. A beam somewhere shifting, the hens murmuring once, Pepper moving in the stall. The box sat on the table, and I sat across from it, and I did not reach for it yet. I got up before I touched it and found the cold chisel in the bottom of the tool chest by the back door, and the ball-peen hammer hanging on its nail above. I set them on the table beside the box and sat back down. The weld ran all the way around the seam. I could see that now in the lamplight. Someone had laid 3 full passes on every edge. Whoever welded this had not been careless. I set the chisel at the corner where the lid met the body and tapped it once, gently, just to feel the resistance. The rust gave a little, the iron did not. It took 40 minutes. I worked around the seam in sections, driving the chisel in short strokes, moving to the next section, coming back. The hammer rang against the chisel, and I thought about the hour, and I kept going. The lid began to lift at one corner around the 20-minute mark, and I worked back and forth from there, prying up by inches. My right palm blistered where I was gripping the chisel shank. I did not stop. The lid came free. Inside, a square of oilcloth folded twice, tied with a strip of leather that had gone nearly black. Under my hands, it felt like something organic, like the skin of an old animal. I untied the leather carefully. The oilcloth unfolded in 3 layers, and inside the 3rd layer were 3 pieces of paper. The largest was the land patent deed. The paper was heavy, formal, printed in the typeface of a government office. At the top, the words, United States of America, in large engraved letters. Below that, the description of the land. The northeast quarter of the southwest quarter and the northwest quarter of the southeast quarter. The legal language running down the page in columns. Signed at the bottom and notarized, the seal still faintly legible in the paper's surface. The second sheet was a hand-drawn survey, detailed and precise, with a signature at the bottom, a name I recognized from what the neighbor had told me about deputy surveyors of that era. The third was a letter, 2 pages, front and back, written in a hand that pressed hard into the paper, not elegant, but deliberate, dated October 9, 1887. I read it once. Then, I read it again. She had buried it herself. A woman I had never met, 67 years before this night, had stood at the northeast corner of this farm and pushed this box into the cold Iowa ground, because she did not trust a stranger with the only paper that made the land hers. She had been right not to trust him. I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with the 3 documents laid flat in front of me, waited at the corners with a coffee mug and a salt shaker and 2 flathead nails I found in my coat pocket. The kerosene lamp burned low. Outside, something moved in the hay, Pepper shifting weight, probably, restless in the cold. At first light, I folded the documents carefully along their original creases, wrapped them in the oilcloth I'd used to carry them home, and walked 1.5 miles west. The neighbor answered the door before I knocked twice. He looked at my face, then at what I was carrying, and stepped aside without a word. He read slowly. He turned the patent over and examined the back. He held the survey up to the window light and traced the boundary lines with one finger, not touching the ink. He read the letter twice, same as I had. When he set it down, he was quiet for a moment, that stretched long enough I heard a crow outside, then another. "This is real," he said, not a question. He told me what it meant. A federal land patent issued under the Homestead Act is not a deed in the ordinary sense. It is a conveyance directly from the United States government. No state instrument, no county-recorded mortgage, no lien filed at any level below federal can extinguish the underlying title once the patent is properly recorded. The bank's note, whatever it said, whatever year it claimed, was written against a title the bank never actually held. He drove. I sat in the passenger seat of his truck, with the oilcloth package on my lap, and watched Shelby County pass outside the window. Frozen fields, bare elms, a water tower with the town name painted in letters I could read from 1 mile out. The recorder's office was on the 2nd floor of the courthouse. The woman behind the counter was perhaps 60, with reading glasses on a chain, and the particular unhurried manner of someone who has handled documents longer than most people have been alive. She took the patent from me with both hands. 90 minutes. She consulted 2 reference volumes, made 3 telephone calls I couldn't hear from the bench where I sat, and wrote notes in a ledger in a careful hand. When she came back to the counter, she told me she would begin the formal recording process that afternoon. The neighbor used the courthouse telephone to reach Pruitt at the bank. I watched from across the room, I couldn't hear the other end of the line, but I saw the neighbor's expression stay even, and I saw him wait through a silence that went on longer than any silence in a normal conversation has a right to go. He sat on the bench another 40 minutes after the neighbor hung up the telephone. The neighbor came and sat beside him and said nothing for a while. Then he said the man at the bank had gone quiet for a long time, and then said he would need to consult the institution's legal counsel. The neighbor said he had told him to consult whoever he liked, that the federal patent was being recorded that afternoon under the Homestead Act of 1862, and that the underlying title had never been validly encumbered. He said the man at the bank had not responded to that. He had simply set down the telephone. The woman behind the counter, her name was on a small placard he had not read until now, Agnes Fole, County Recorder, came back at 10:14 in the morning and set a document on the counter in front of him. It was a certified copy of the filed patent, stamped in blue ink with the date and the recorder's seal and her signature beneath it. She told him the original would be held in the county vault. She told him the recording superseded any lien against the underlying title. She said it the way she might describe the weather, plainly, without theater, because the facts did not require any. He thanked her. She nodded and returned to her desk. He drove back alone. The neighbor had offered to follow, but he said no, he was all right. The road home was the same road it had always been. 4 miles of county blacktop, with the frozen fields running flat to both horizons, and the sky low and white. He passed the Doane mailbox. He passed the stand of cottonwoods at the half-mile mark. He came up the lane and parked beside the barn and turned the engine off. He sat in the cab. The certified copy was on the seat beside him in the oilcloth. The land was outside the windshield, all 140 acres of it, the pasture still pale with the last of the frost, the cattle visible as dark shapes near the eastern fence, the dead oak standing at the corner where he had left it standing. He did not feel what he had expected to feel. He thought he would feel relief, or something large and declarative. What he felt instead was tired and very still, the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from the sudden absence of a pressure that has been against you so long you stopped noticing its weight. He looked at the land for a long time before he reached for the door handle. He got out of the truck. He pulled on his grandfather's canvas barn coat, the dark green one, oil-stained at the left cuff, and went to the barn and got the post-hole digger and a cedar post from the stack along the south wall. He carried them across the pasture to the northeast corner. The ground was still cold, not frozen through, but cold enough that the digger rang against pebbles and sent the shock up through his palms and into his wrists. He worked slowly. There was no reason to hurry anymore. The dead oak stood 8 feet to his left. He had thought, in the days since he dug the hole, that he might cut it down, clear the corner, take the wood, be practical about it. He decided against that sometime during the drive back from town. He wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe because of the fallen limb pointing northeast, which he understood now had pointed toward something true for 67 years without anyone knowing to follow it. You don't cut down a thing like that. You leave it standing and let it mean what it means. He set the post at the corner marker, a rusted iron pin he'd found by scraping away the sod with his boot heel, and tamped the dirt down in layers the way his grandfather had shown him once, years ago, using the wooden handle turned sideways so the pressure came even from all directions. It took 20 minutes. When he was done, he stepped back and looked at it. Straight. Good. The shadow of the oak came across the ground at a long angle in the late afternoon light, and the tip of it touched the base of the new post, almost exactly. He noticed that and did not say anything about it to anyone, because there was no one there to say it to. I think about the drawer nobody opened, the chest with the false bottom, the entry in a journal dated 11 years before the man who wrote it died, telling whoever came after exactly where to look, as if he always knew someone would need it, someday, under exactly this kind of pressure. The people who built things that lasted didn't always get to see them last. Sometimes they buried the proof and trusted the ground to keep it, and trusted someone down the line to go looking when the time came. I was 18 years old, and I almost didn't go looking. If any of this sounds like something you've lived, a farm, a box, a drawer that surprised you, I'd like to hear it in the comments. And if you know someone who's been told they're too young for what's in front of them, show them this. The land keeps what it's given, sometimes for a very long time.